I have seen leadership and access to power really cost people their humanity in ways that are really scary to see. And so I want to name that kind of explicitly because I think there's so much in leadership and power that we don't always talk about. We talk about leadership as sort of this, thing to always aspire to without really thinking about how leadership is also potentially proximity to or access to power. And that power can be used for good or for evil in a lot of different ways.
Welcome to Lonely at the Top, a podcast for high-level leaders carrying the invisible weight of the world because the higher you rise, the fewer people you can safely talk to. Here we welcome founders, executives, and decision makers who feel the isolation and pressure that comes with power. Lonely at the Top is your sanctuary in the storm, and I'm your host, executive coach and former psychotherapist, Rachel Alexandria. Today on the podcast, we have Shivani Mehta Bhatia. She's a facilitator, advisor, and writer based in New York City. She works with senior leaders at justice-rooted organizations, especially queer folks and women of color, helping them use conflict as diagnostic information about power, culture, and what needs to change. She came to this work after a decade inside public health, crisis response, and community-based care where she kept noticing the same pattern. The most persistent strategy problems were always relational ones, rooted in power, story, and unaddressed conflict. She's also the author and host of Intimate Practice, an ongoing research project on birth, sex, and death work. This is going to be a rich conversation today. And it's been a minute since we tried to get together. So thanks for getting here, Shivani.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. I'm so thrilled to finally be here.
Yay! Okay, so I guess I always start with how we know each other.
Yeah.
So we know each other mostly tangentially. We're both in an organization called Deeper Business Foundations. This is where I meet a lot of people who are doing really cool work in the world all over the globe, really, because you're in New York City.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So how did you get into the kind of work that you do? That is what I'm most curious about to start with.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like I have a different answer to this question every single time. But the truest answer is that I wanted to be a doctor when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was obsessed with anatomy and bodies and how the body actually worked and how systems of care worked. I was the 4 or 5, 6-year-old kid feeding my dolls medicine that I pulled out of the backyard garden. I was second grade, dragging my mother down to the library basement to pull out herbal medicine textbooks. I just have always been interested in health and bodies and how we recover from things. So that's kind of the oldest story. That brought me into what I thought was going to be clinical work and actually ended up being systems of care and public health, which I absolutely loved. And in public health work, I was doing primarily maternal death prevention work. So I was facilitating this group of people around why do people die during pregnancy or up to a year postpartum? How do we prevent those deaths from happening? It was brilliant work, very contentious work. That's the death work sort of part of my background. And then when the pandemic hit, I was deployed to the pandemic response. I was doing a lot of health equity work for a state. That was sort of my process was how do we design a health equity strategy in the middle of a pandemic? And all of those strategy questions, all of that facilitation work, all of those high octane sort of death work and high pressure situations were pressure cookers for conflict. And the way that we got through them was by working well with conflict, figuring out how to disagree really well together and when to be pretty strategically on each other's side, when to name the thing that nobody wanted to talk about. So yeah, that's kind of how I found my way there. And conflict has sort of become a home ever since.
So tell me, I really want to ask some clarifying questions.
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm a smart person, but sometimes I'm slow to pick up on
a lot of
pieces. Yeah, and I just assume that people listening may know less than I do or the same that I do. So sure. Yeah. I like to clarify, what is health equity?
Yeah. Health equity is one of those phrases that nobody knew about for the longest, quote unquote, nobody knew about for the longest time. It was like jargon up until 2020. And I remember the day that my mother called me. She's like, "You're the only person I've ever heard use this phrase, health equity, and now it's all over the news. What is happening?" And it's such a pandemic phrase in a lot of ways. Health equity is really, it's health and equity. So if we break those down, health is, I take a really expansive definition of health, that we have a human right to the dignity of choice when it comes to how we define our health and well-being. And this, it's not just the WHO definition is about like not just the absence of disease or infirmity, but actually this self-determined sense of well-being. And it's a very biopsychosocial kind of approach. So it's physiological, it's social, it's psychological. What does like wellness sort of mean? So that's the health part of health equity. And then equity is usually the kind of paired phrase with equality, right? So equality is sameness. Equality is that everybody is treated the same. Equity is more about, does everybody have what they need? Equitable access is about, do people have access in the ways that they need to, and also that are potentially modulated by different power dynamics. So if you are a person who, like I live in a disabled body, do I have access to the kinds of care that I need? That might be different than an able-bodied person. That's one of the examples of equity. It often also comes along in DEI as the acronym, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, you know, we can talk about the politics of that aside, but the equity portion of that is, do people have what they need, and do they have what they need in equitable ways as opposed to equal ways?
Yeah, I was just reading an article this morning talking about how lots of states' Medicaid programs and Medicare, I forget which one, are removing access to GLP-1s.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, just recently, because it's become expensive for them. And so you have, like, now it's going to be for a while, not like this is surprising about anything else about health, but the haves having access to GLP-1s and GLP-2s, and the have-nots not. And yeah, so I imagine this is something that would come up in health equity, like the appropriate access based on your circumstance to what you need in order to really be well.
Yeah. It's about access in terms of what you need to be well. It's also about like who kind of bears the burden of like the disproportionate burden of death, disease, and disability. So at least in my work with COVID, with maternal death prevention, it was like essentially how does systemic racism, how does systemic outcomes really affect certain populations differently? How does it lead to, you know, certain populations dying more frequently of COVID, for example, and how do we prevent that from happening or shift that from happening and make sure those resources are allocated well for those populations?
Wow. So when I invited you onto the show,
we were not going to go down that rabbit hole.
No, I don't. You know what? I don't want to talk about constantly the same thing on the show.
Yeah.
I really like meeting people and diving into people's experiences that are very different than mine, that are people who are exercising leadership in all kinds of places. And me and the audience, we all have to understand, what is this other world in order to make sense of it, right? Like, I don't want anything homogenized or overly simplistic. That's not interesting.
Yeah.
So no, I'm totally into it. I'm like wondering, because it's so different than my experience, right? And it's so different than like a corporate boss type of experience. It sounds very community oriented. And when you talk about things like we, you say we a lot. Who is the we? Are these different organizations you've been part of? Like, how does your work? And who do you work with / for?
Great question. Well, so that work that I talked about was all when I worked for a state government. So that was government public health. And I've worked state, local, federal, I've worked with state, local, and federal government public health agencies. And so that's, you know, all kind of layers of that. Now my work is both with people within those agencies and entities, but also the kind of network of organizations that support all of that work. So that's foundations, it's philanthropies, nonprofits, even some social impact, mission-driven, for-profit companies that are focused on creating some sort of change in the world, creating some sort of sense of well-being in the world, whatever that looks like, whatever. So I've worked with environmental justice groups, I've worked with reproductive justice groups, I've done, again, this kind of state, local public health work, community advocacy groups, policy groups, things like that. So the we in public health is usually quite expansive because we take such a we, the profession, take such a systems level approach to everything that nobody really acts by themselves, right? And I mean, that kind of even just comes back to this whole kind of driving concept of change and conflict, is that it's a we thing. We create change together. It's not something that a person can act on their own to affect in the same kind of way.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And yeah, that is helpful. So it sounds like you've been part of or cooperating with in a variety of different roles. What is your experience of like being in leadership, and do you ever experience it as lonely?
Yeah. Oh gosh, great question. It's interesting. I now working to support leaders within these agencies, I see the loneliness a lot more than I felt when I was doing it myself. Or then potentially I realized at the time. What I have found, I work with a lot of nonprofit executive directors in particular, or philanthropy program officers, for example, who are leading a grant program or supporting a community engagement effort. And what I have found most often is those are people who worked their way up through the chain, right? They're often queer folks, they're often women of color, they're people who have worked their way up the chain often by calling out power dynamics, often by calling out problems with the system. And then they get to a point of leadership that they have, previously not had access to. And all of a sudden they are being accused of some of the similar things, some of the same patterns that they were calling out before. And specifically the point of loneliness that I find in that is that sometimes it's true that they are actually replicating those patterns of harm. And sometimes it's not true that they're replicating those patterns of harm. And they have to kind of work through that on their own. They don't often have support systems in place. The people that they used to go to for support or to kind of untangle whatever that thorny question is are not the people that they used to be able to turn to, or they can't turn to those people anymore. And so that I found to be a really lonely space to be in.
So you're, at the time that you were in those kinds of positions, you weren't cognizant of experiencing that problem, is what I heard you say.
Not explicitly. Like, I don't think, if you had asked me 10 years ago, are you lonely in this job? I don't know that I would have said yes, because I was working with people all the time. And also, looking back, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point about leadership, and I don't think we've talked about it a lot on the show yet, that people, and especially in this moment of time where there is a fervor around the critique of any public person. Mm-hmm. If you're on the right, you might call this cancel culture, right? But if you're on the left, it's just like we're holding people to account. And I mean, it's angry mobs, and the angry mobs are sometimes right. And there's decisions that get made in leadership by any leader that are going to look unpopular, that are going to be inscrutable to the people who are not in the private room, because they have to be. Like, compromises and deals have to be made sometimes, right? And so I can imagine, like, I watch a lot of public commentary about public figures in general. I don't tend to participate, but I read a lot. And I just watch how it just takes the slightest misstep for people to suddenly have a bunch of haters who say somebody sold out and that they're not a friend of the movement and whatever. And so that has to be very alienating.
Well, yeah, there's a couple pieces of that or threads in that I think I want to tease out. There's one that is, I work with a lot of women of color leaders in particular who get to a certain level, and there's often a question of, they will make a decision, and the question they receive often, or the pushback they receive, they kind of have to be in a space of like, is this actually a question of my decision, or is this just somebody uncomfortable with a woman of color saying no? So that's sort of one phenomenon. And, there's a lot kind of wrapped up for that leader in terms of how have they come to that decision? How do they kind of handle that pushback? How do they parse through what is that? What is actually critique or feedback that is worth taking and receiving and integrating in some kind of way, and what is actually just people responding to a woman of color saying no.
Yeah.
There's a piece that's that. There's also a piece that I was thinking about this when you said this, like holding people to account, right? I think we have a really messed up relationship with the word accountability, to be honest. There's a kind of a few different pieces in this, right? Accountability is actually this really beautiful thing, can be this really beautiful thing. Most of the time when we are in relationship and I come to you and I say, hey, this thing that you said really hurt me. That is actually an invitation towards much deeper relationship, right? That's actually an invitation towards some kind of intimacy. That is me saying, I really want to continue this relationship with you. I am trying in the ways that I have access to mend something, to repair something, to move us into a better or more shared understanding of what just happened and who we are to each other and who we want to be to each other, right? So that process of accountability can be really beautiful. When it is used in this much more public fashion, we're not in relationship with some of those people. We can't actually hold people accountable who we are not in relationship with. And so this more like public phenomenon, or online, I think, phenomenon of quote unquote cancel culture, or, calling people out in this like public way. There are times that like it makes sense for public figures. Sure. Yes, absolutely. And also the way that we use it in these much more personal sorts of ways, like doesn't really make sense online. It doesn't really make sense as like, that is not the space for it often. So yeah, it's one of those words that I think a lot of this thinking also, I should say, comes from Mia Mingus's framing of accountability and transformative justice, and their like really phenomenal work in that movement. But it's, I think, a much deeper and kinder, honestly, approach to accountability than the much more flattened kind of version that we see in public discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything you're saying. Like, I just reread this quote the other day, and now I'm not going to remember who said it, unfortunately. But there's I want to say a celebrity, probably a male celebrity, who said, if somebody has a problem with me, they should text me, like implying that if you know me well enough to have this conversation, you have my number.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think the flip side of that is often like we're also not taught how to receive that feedback sometimes. And so we perceive, if I were to get a text, for example, to say, hey, you like really hurt me in some way, it's very easy for me to have a shame response around that. For any of us, we've all kind of been taught, if somebody says, hey, you hurt me, that means that you are bad, right?
Person.
That means that I'm a bad person. I have done something bad. That's so much of the conversation around, is this person racist or not? Is this person misogynist or not? Like, it's sort of beside the point in some ways, especially if we consider all of these things to be like systems of oppression. But I think the skill of that, the flip of that, is that we can then engage with that shame, right? We can engage with like, hey, this person is actually trying to have a better and deeper relationship with me. And can I take that as an invitation, an act of love, and not an attack, not something that I need to internalize as like, I am a bad person.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you and I have, I think, very companionable takes on conflict.
Yeah. Yes.
So I have like 3 different questions.
Sure.
Do you advise people, or like, so you have this knowledge about dealing with conflict, and it sounds like you work with these leaders who are experiencing loneliness. Are you getting to advise them on navigating disagreements and conflict, or?
Yeah. I work in a couple different ways. I work as a conflict facilitator and mediator. So when there is an active conflict, you can call me up and I will come in and kind of work through like what is actually in front of us? What are all the stories beneath the stories? How do we choose what needs to be repaired here? What can't be repaired? And how do we choose to move forward? And I do that with groups of 5 to 25 people, depending on kind of what that can look like. I also do it kind of before the eruption actually happens. That's usually like the post eruption, right? But I facilitate change processes when there is sort of we have a decision that we need to make and we don't want it to devolve. We have a new strategic plan. We need to invite a bunch of community engagement. We need to, understand how people think about this, or we need to shift priorities. Budget's been cut, something, leadership transition, like those kinds of transition points when we know a change is coming that is ripe for the potential of conflict. I help facilitate those conversations. And then I also work one-on-one with leaders in like a coaching sort of process of how do you get better at not internalizing that feedback, or being able to discern what is the feedback that I actually do need to take and what is the feedback that I really don't need to take, and how do you kind of both do that internally but also coach your team members or your other folks in your life around that.
Hey, quick pause. If you've been listening to Lonely at the Top and something's landed, a story, a line, a moment that hit different, I want to hear about it. Feedback shapes where my show goes, and I read every message. If what you're carrying right now is bigger than a comment, if there's a pattern that you're ready to get out of, a decision that feels like you're stuck in it, or a version of yourself you're ready to leave behind, I'm opening a limited number of discounted magic sessions for listeners this month. One session, real movement. The link is in the show notes. Come find out what's actually possible when someone sees to the heart of what's going on and can help you get out. That's it. Back to the episode. And how did you get so good at that? I'm wondering if it's a similar story to mine.
I mean, I'm laughing because it's, eldest immigrant daughter energy of like being the mediator always. And also, I was just writing about this actually a couple days ago of people often ask me, like, how did you become a facilitator? Like, what was the training that you had for this? How did you kind of get there? And I've taken trainings on facilitation. I've studied conflict mediation before. And also I facilitated a group of 35 people about death prevention every 6 weeks at 7:30 in the morning for 3 hours for 5 years.
That'll do it.
I've facilitated this group of people in the middle of a pandemic response of how do we make sure that people don't die when we don't have the resources from state or federal government that we need to have in order to make this happen effectively. Like, I just had a lot of conflict that we were working with, and I saw the potential for how to do it well.
Nice. Yeah, I get it. I mean, I find that people who are comfortable with difficult conversations are so relaxing to be around,
Yeah.
And I think I embody that. Like, I just did some work without getting into personal details about people that were involved. I facilitate a friend group situation, and there was several moments of pretty significant conflict that came up.
Yeah.
And someone was like, you don't need to intervene. And I'm like, but I do, because you don't understand what will happen to this group if this is not resolved in some sort of way.
Yeah. I think that's the other piece of it too, for my story also, is that I've had conflict go really badly. I've had relationships end when conflict wasn't handled well, when we couldn't have the conversation, when we couldn't find this point of connection, when we avoided the hard conversation because we were afraid, like at the other side of this is I've been asked before, like, you must just be so good at this. And I'm like, no, actually, I learned some really hard lessons too. Yes, I have become practiced and I've built up a skill set around it and I have frameworks and everything too, but it's not like an innate thing that some people, I think, just go towards conflict and some people don't. I really believe that it is a set of relational skills that we can learn and practice and be with each other on. And part of why I believe that is because I have seen it go really badly and I've lost relationships that meant the world to me, truly, truly the world to me, and were incredibly painful to lose because we didn't know how to handle conflict well, or we couldn't repair the things that we needed to repair.
Yeah. I mean, similar. Yeah. I decided to get good at conflict because I had two very serious relationships end. And looking at the aftermath, I was like, well, which part is mine? What part is on my street to clean up? And my part was, I'm not good at conflict. I was scared of it. I thought it was better to avoid it, to just resolve it inside myself, which doesn't work, So, yeah, I recognize it. I recognize what you're talking about. Okay. So let me get into, I want to ask this question because I always ask these questions. What is a leadership decision or season that really tested you?
Yeah. I would say that pandemic season really tested me for many reasons. I had already been doing a lot of death work. It was a very high pressure time, a very frantic time. This was about 6 months into the pandemic, so end of 2020. And so we were already kind of in this just state of intensity, state of panic, state of emergency for such a long time. people were moving very quickly. I was also in a state at the time where, when this wasn't just the state that I was in federally, like we're right now, even today in this moment where, Fauci is getting questioned in these very aggressive ways. And I think a lot of people kind of outside of the public health or healthcare world knew that it was difficult or knew that we were getting a lot of pressure, but maybe don't know quite how bad it was. And we were told at the department that I worked at to take our parking stickers off of our cars so that nobody would know where we worked or that nobody would know that we worked at the health department, because people were getting doxxed. People were getting harassed for trying to save lives, trying to make sure that more people didn't die, trying to make sure that people could quarantine safely, trying to make sure that people got vaccinated. And that there's like a lot of moral injury, I think, wrapped up in that, right? Both for so many of us in the field, but also kind of outside of the field as well, of like, how do you kind of grapple with the reality that when public health is successful, it is silent. It's behind the scenes. People don't see it. And so when it all of a sudden is out in the open, it's seen as a failure when it actually had a lot of potential. So there's sort of that aspect of it. There was also this aspect of like just the responsibility. I was, working for a state that had 7 or so million people, and we were like very intensely felt the responsibility of trying to create a health equity plan that would support 7 million people's lives, right? Like, so it was not a small thing.
Yeah, that sounds very daunting.
Yeah. And then the last piece of that too is the actual group that I was facilitating. We were called the Health Equity Working Group. I trained previously as a birth and abortion doula. I have a lot of kind of background in trauma-informed care and rape crisis counseling and things like that. And so I was also kind of bringing a lot of that trauma-informed care to the facilitation practice. Like, how do we make this a supportive space for knowing that all this moral injury is kind of around us for the 20 or so people who are in this room right now and are being actively traumatized and also trying to prevent a lot of other kind of secondary trauma, all the rest of it. How do we actually offer a trauma-informed space for that group? And like that part is, yes, it was like, I'm describing all of the intensity of it and the pressure of it and the difficulty of it. That group was phenomenal. It was so incredible to work with. It was so profound to see how much people came together, how much they needed that space. Also, people talked about it as kind of like the most supportive aspect of the pandemic response for state level employees at the time. Like, that was a really profound thing to hear and also to kind of witness it happening, that we could all take care of each other in these ways and also, make it so that undocumented people had access to funding so that they could quarantine safely in ways that they had not been able to before. That happened.
Oh, okay. Everybody listening, take a big breath here. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll ever be over the trauma of the pandemic because we never had a global, ritual or reckoning or integration.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some people walking around who are okay, but let's just take a moment and acknowledge that most of us, life got thrown sideways when that happened. And we gradually came back to some sort of semblance of normalcy, but it's never been the same. And for most of us, it was unacknowledged.
Completely. And I don't even know that in a sense that we had, like, most of us have a sense of normalcy. I think it is a kind of suppressed thing. It was a mass disabling event. People's bodies have changed. People's lives have changed. People lost so many of their loved ones. And yeah, we had no acknowledgement of it here in the U.S. whatsoever.
Mm-mm. Yeah. So if you're listening to this, maybe this is an opportunity, sitting with the two of us to acknowledge, safely, not like while you're driving your car or doing something important, but maybe making a note to just acknowledge the grief and the difficulty and know that millions of other people went through that too, and you're not alone. Yeah, it just feels important. Like, talking about all that, I could feel it building in my body. And I was like, I love that you folks were there for each other. And it sounds like it was really nourishing in the midst of a lot of emergency.
Yeah.
And, I don't think anybody listening to this show would do this, but, don't attack people who are trying to help you. Oh, okay. So on this show, we get to look into the private ledger of leaders because at the top, no one sees your balance sheet of burdens. But here we like to ask 3 things. First, what was one cost you paid for being in leadership?
I'm like trying to think back to that time too. I mean, I left the field of public health in a lot of ways, so that might have been a cost. I think the moral injury of it had, really forced me to kind of take stock of how do I want to show up in this work. I gave a lot more of myself to it than I actually had to give, and I then paid the price of that by like having to step back for a very long time. And now I'm able to, I support the field, I support people in the field, but I am not actively working for a public health department anymore, even though that is my training and background. That was a choice that I made. Yeah, that feels like a hard thing to name as a cost explicitly because it has brought me also so much.
Well, it shifted your career trajectory.
Yeah, exactly. It pretty dramatically shifted my career trajectory. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a cost, right? Every time we have to, step off of the path like that is taking us upward and start over in some sort of alternate branch. Yeah. That's a cost of time and accrued abundance, honestly. So
completely
valid.
Completely. Yeah. I'll say too, in the leaders that I've worked with or with the leaders with whom I've worked, I have seen leadership and access to power really cost people their humanity in ways that are really scary to see. And so I want to name that kind of explicitly because I think there's so much in leadership and power that we don't always talk about. We talk about leadership as sort of this thing to always aspire to without really thinking about how leadership is also potentially proximity to or access to power. And that power can be used for good or for evil in a lot of different ways. And so it's that old adage, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Like I think I've seen power and access to leadership shape people's access to their own humanity. And that is one of the most profound costs for me that I have really informed most of my work now in conflict and power and systems change.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably too simplistic or too reductive, but I think a good rule of thumb is power, like money, amplifies what you already have going on.
I agree.
It's one of the reasons why I work with the clientele I do. I work with leaders because I really am passionate about helping them retain access to their humanity and be able to be their authentic selves in a healthy way without amplifying any of the bad patterns they inherited or, either taking it out on the people that they lead or taking it out on themselves.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, I'm often asking people I work with, how do you steward power well rather than wield it when you think you have it? Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. We are never the owners of money. We are not the owners of power when it comes to the collective. Yeah, I agree with that. And that's the sickness, right? When we start to think that we do, and then it becomes a hoarding disease.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting into the systemic weeds here. Let's come back to what's one invisible asset you didn't realize you had at the time?
Yeah, I mean, turning towards the hard conversation, I think that has been, said earlier, it's not something innate. And also, I'm someone who turns towards the hard conversation as often as possible, right? Like, not always. I think I've developed a sense of discernment around that in a much better way than I had before. But for most of my life, have been willing to, I will go have the hard conversation. I will go say the thing that feels really scary to say. And I've, learned to do that with a lot more kindness and gentleness and discernment and all the rest of it, certainly. And also, I think that's a skill I didn't know how to value at the beginning.
Nice. Yeah, definitely skillful. I love that. Okay, what's one investment that you're making now for your well-being or your soul?
Oh, yeah. A lot of space and time, a lot of writing. That has been a real gift. I take really excellent care of my body now in a way that I did not used to when I was in leadership before, right? I really prioritize getting outside and moving my body and eating well and all of these things that we and sleep. in a way that feels so basic to say, but I do think it's like one of those costs that we often pay without totally realizing it, and it's become much more of a non-negotiable for me. And so I am feeding my body and my brain with, actual food and sleep and writing and creative practice and all the rest of it in ways that I did not let myself do when I thought the work was kind of everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I really admire that, and I co-sign that. Like, I know I cannot be the kind of leader that I want to be, that I am proud of being, unless I'm taking care of me, because my channels of receiving and understanding are muted or corroded or whatever if I'm not in a place where I'm in good alignment with my body and my mind and my heart. Yeah, nice. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our conversation, but I have two questions before we wrap. The first one is, what do you wish more leaders felt permission to say out loud?
This hurts and I'm sorry.
Ooh, say more, please.
I think there's a couple of things. I think leaders are, especially the leaders that I work with, right, queer folks and women of color, are often having to be in positions where they are performing and they have to kind of present a front of nothing can touch me, nothing can hurt me. And so I think this saying that actually really hurt is admitting to a vulnerability that feels really dangerous to say out loud sometimes, but can be really powerful. And as always, I recommend a lot of discernment around this. I don't think that's just something we say to anybody, but I do think, it's an important thing to develop safety around and be able to say when and where it's safe to do so. And exactly the same with I'm sorry. I think it's admitting to have caused harm in a way that can also be really dangerous potentially to, or can feel really dangerous to a leader and somebody in power, somebody in a position, to admit fault, to admit I made a mistake, I messed this up in some way. Again, discernment as always, but that also is a skill set to be able to say, yes, I see that you are hurt and I see that I caused this hurt, and the intention of the intent that I had with this doesn't actually necessarily matter always. It's, the impact of how this landed. Yeah, I think those are the two things I wish people had a little bit more ability to say, and also that we offered each other a little bit more safety in being able to receive it.
Yeah, those are great. All right, before we get to our last question, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, and I know that you have writing that you share with beautiful pieces and, thought pieces, where would they find that? And is there any kind of way they can connect with you if they would like to?
Yeah, definitely. The best way to find all my work is on my website. It's www.shivani.co, shivani.co. And I have both essays and pieces on there, but I share those out in a weekly newsletter called Intimate Practice, weekly-ish, I should say, newsletter called Intimate Practice, which you can also sign up for on the site. That's really the best way to connect with me. And I also love working with people one-on-one. I think that's one of my favorite. I love facilitating groups for sure, but I really enjoy working with people one-on-one. And I have a few spots this fall that I'm opening up for leaders, especially, again, women of color and queer folks in leadership who want to go a little bit deeper on how do I build this discernment? How do I build this skill set? So yeah, that's all on my website.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll put that in the show notes too, so people can access it. All right. So our last question is where we open the time machine. Yes. If you could go back in time, what would you say to yourself earlier in your career?
These are such great questions, Rachel. I would say to myself, I think I would have really encouraged my younger self to take up space in the kind of fullness of herself in a way that I don't think I ever really let myself do. I did a lot of that performance of I have to present a certain kind of a front or a certain lack of vulnerability that I thought was keeping me safe. I thought would kind of protect me from harm or keep me in certain spaces that I wanted to stay in, and they weren't actually accepting to the fullness of who I was, and so it never was going to work in the beginning. So yeah, that's the encouragement that I would have for that younger version of me. Yeah. With a lot of love and care for the fact that she did the best with the information that she had at the time, and also I think that's the wisdom of life.
I like that. It's sort of akin to fail faster, right? Be you more, and just push away all the people who aren't the right fit, who don't get it. But yeah, I like that. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really a pleasure. Yeah, to hear about your work and your trajectory. And I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks for taking a moment to tune in with me today. And thanks for listening to Lonely at the Top. If this conversation resonated today, I hope you'll give yourself permission to pause and check in with what you might be carrying, because you don't have to hold it all alone. I am an executive coach who works with spiritually inclined powerhouses, especially those who want to clean up difficult relationships and other secret messes. You can learn more at rachelalexandria.com. If you know another leader who needs to hear this show, please send it their way. Because yeah, it's lonely at the top, but it doesn't have to stay that way.